You mentioned in there the multicultural frame, and again, I know in my own work there is a tendency for some of the people that I'm working with to slip into thinking about culturally responsive schooling as very similar to multicultural education and picking up that line and thread. So could you talk to me a little about how you see the difference between a multicultural approach to education and a culturally responsive approach?
Yes, that's another interesting one. I suppose, again, here you've got two terms, multiculturalism and culturally responsive. The way that I sort of understand how language works here is that the sort of terms that we're mentioning are sort of place markers for some bigger, more complicated project. So you say the term and then you need to actually elaborate the content because the term doesn't say anything actually on its own. So I know in my own sort of reading over the years, there's been a lot of debate around what is multiculturalism as a sort of an educational project, and you will remember, who was it, maybe McLaren and Giroux wrote a piece that sort of juxtaposed three different sorts of multiculturalism, and we're making an argument for a critical multicultural educational project. So I did use the concept earlier, but probably it's not one that I sort of invoke generally to sort of name what I'm doing because of the sort of confusions around it. Even though I think it would be possible, if we'd started again 2 or 3 years ago, to be claiming or naming the project up as a form of critical multiculturalism. It's just, I suppose, the multiculturalism terms are usually a key word that names some characteristics of a society, where culturally responsive pedagogy is the term that educators have already been using and is much more sort of specific about what educators are up to. So I think probably they're cousins. I could imagine writing a paper that was, multiculturalism and culturally responsive pedagogy. Again, making a case for a critical form of multiculturalism.
Well, I think the work of
if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think the work of Stephen May.
Stephen May,
New Zealand is picking up and talks a little bit about those points of connection.
You remember the time in Australia when Howard couldn't use the M word, so the way these keywords sort of get used in the public space about what language one can use to name up things. And, he couldn't say sorry and couldn't say multiculturalism. Yeah, but anyway, I don't know. Again, in the Australian context, there's probably the concept of multiculturalism in education is not really well developed either.
No.
It'd be weakly developed, I think, if you have a look at the Australian archive.
Yeah, no, I would agree that it
probably insulted a lot of my friends, but.
But the notion of a multicultural policy and that description of Australia as multiculturalism, that whole discourse around that and the politics around that, again, I find that permeates into this space when I'm working with teachers quite a bit. Yeah, okay. I mean, as I say, I think for me, it's a key word that names something characteristic about the nation, and in the rationale that I shared earlier. I think when we're celebrating ourselves, we claim to be one of the most viable multicultural nations in the world, and probably rightly so at some level. But meantime, there's a lot of issues that need a little bit of attention around what that means. There's also some of the politic, I guess, around whether or not multiculturalism is an appropriate or useful conversation in connection with the experiences of Indigenous students or Indigenous studies in education.
I was only reading a paper the other day that was making the argument that it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of serious issues with how multiculturalism frames up the problem and laminates over colonisation fundamentally.
I think bringing them too close together is fundamentally problematic. You're losing issues of sovereignty and a treaty, and it changes the nature of the...
I think one of the things that sort of, invoking the concept of multiculturalism, the sort of naive fairy floss version, you have sort of... tolerant liberal multiculturalism, in which we all have a warm inner glow about how wonderful it all is. Meantime, of course, as far as I can see, when you dig around not very much into the sort of rationality of that, basically you end up with, oh yes, we like all the others, but really you've got to be like us. That's where the sort of tolerant multiculturalism ends up. I guess that's where making an argument for some critical multiculturalism becomes quite important as a critique of some of that. But more recently, of course, we've moved from liberal political philosophy as the dominant version of how we organise governing to a neoliberalising one, in which case we've now got neoliberalising multiculturalism, and there's not been much research or theorising around that, but I've found some recently, and certainly the way that sort of gets rendered is it's all around the entrepreneurial subject and being totally responsible for themselves. So you end up with, I think, a sort of very toxic version of what that looks like. More critiques are required, really, around how neoliberals are rendering the multicultural subject.
Reading through one of your papers, you were talking about in relation to the project 5 characteristics of this culturally responsive approach that you're starting to develop and theorise. And I found it interesting to note that you didn't make explicit mention of deficit discourse or concerns with the deficit approach. And I was wanting to ask why, and could you talk through that a little bit?
The sort of contesting deficit is sort of foundational for my research program, and it's sort of like an entree for me. But when I'm working with teachers, what I'm trying to do there is to engage in some dialogue with them around a sort of positive, productive pedagogical project that's antithetical to deficit. So the propositions that I'm sort of trying to work with the teachers doesn't mention deficit at all. It's actually the antithesis of deficit. And you can't really get to them without understanding that that's what you're doing. But there's no mention of, or at least I hope not. We're not doing the sort of deficit discourse. We're trying to engage in conversations that are against all of that. 5 sort of ideas that we're using to work with teachers. They need to give kids hard things to do, high intellectual challenge, rigour, whatever language you want, which you get again from Indigenous communities right across the Pan-Pacific Rim whenever they're talking about schooling. Got to set our kids hard things to do that are worthwhile and so on. It's got to be strongly connected to kids' lives. The cultural difference in the classroom needs to be understood as an asset for learning and/or the young people themselves feel positive about their own cultural identities in this class. There's some sort of activist orientation, in which case the learning that's going on in the class is doing something to make the world a better place to be, other than just a hoop to jump through for some future credentialing. And the 5th one is a demand that the kids perform their learning for more than just the teacher, and usually that involves sophisticated use of sort of multimodal technologies. So when we start the conversation up around those set of propositions, we start by saying this is what we're on about, and then the next move is tell us what your classroom challenges are, okay? And often the first way that teachers do this is they just pour out all the deficit. So often what that can be is all the things that the kids don't bring to school that are required for them to teach. So they don't do this and they don't do that, and not very productive. And those discourses are sort of rife in some schools. Another way that teachers do that is they try to name up the experiences in the classroom that they struggle with. So behaviour problems, not much engagement, the kid's not achieving. Now that's more interesting because that's sort of an empirical description of the things they're having to deal with, and so then you can then move quicker to something more productive. So okay, fine, that's good. What are we going to do about that? And then because we're using an action research approach, by definition, action research for me is the phenomena being researched is a teacher's own practice. You can't do action research on someone else, fundamentally. I mean, people attempt to do that, but that's nonsense as far as I can see. So when we're trying to facilitate action research, we're trying to provide opportunities for teachers to have a go at doing something different and then systematically research how that's working out for them.
Yep.
And then they report that back. Okay, so when you get into that framework, the thing that's being examined is what are you doing differently. So you can come from, oh, the kids don't bring this to school. Can't work with that actually. Here's the empirical reality of the school. Okay, that's a bit more productive. But then somewhere teachers have got to decide to do something different.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then it's about what they're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've moved from the deficit to them trying to be productive in how they engage with their students, and that's how the process unfolds.
Yeah.
Mostly.
So that's
if that makes sense.
Oh no, that definitely makes sense. So, and that process that you're talking about of focusing on a cultural wealth or a cultural asset, sort of, this is the understanding and the way we want you to approach coming into the class, requires some of that unlearning and that undoing. And so moving through the deficit sort of a discourse and framing, and reflecting on themselves and their own location in relationship to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, say, and history, becomes that vehicle in a way to their own learning and changing and reflecting on their practices. That's how I sort of...
That's it. I mean, there's multiple takes on this. Maybe one of the neatest ones is one of my colleagues, Barbara Comer, who talks about turnaround pedagogy, and she's got quite a brilliant sort of number of accounts and papers and a few books she's written around how she tries to sort of facilitate the turnaround from having the deficit understanding to one that's more sort of assets based. So, and she has her own sort of ways of doing that. Fundamentally, her approach is why don't you just spend a little bit more time just trying to understand that kid who really troubles you for a bit. See what's really going on there.
Yeah.
And often that's the thing that turns the thing around. So all of a sudden there's this kid does this kid's got and so you move from what the kid doesn't bring to school to trying to work with what the kid does bring to school. So all of a sudden there's sort of a shift in fundamental understanding about what's being worked with. Yeah, I think. Anyway, there's multiple takes on different people's approaches to this.
Definitely. I guess in my own work, when I'm trying to work with teachers in and around some of those issues that you're talking about, one of the things I seem to encounter sometimes, and teachers may not name it as Aboriginal learning style theory, but it resonates with an Aboriginal learning style theory sort of understanding of Aboriginal kids learn this way. And if and they come with those preconceived ideas about who and what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids are. And so I find myself needing to try and work through and undo some of that Aboriginal learning style theory. I'd be interested to hear what your experience with that has been.
Yeah, the sort of the learning style stuff's been around for in my career forever. There's been various versions of it, haven't it? So certainly in the sort of Indigenous education space that I work in, the Indigenous scholars I go to, in their own careers have had to sort of contest all of that, and the ones I respect have got very little respect for any persons sort of essentialising Indigenous learners, which is the problem for them. So some essentialising of the learner, which, I mean, the feminist critique of learning styles of girls in the 80s put all that stuff in the bin, but it keeps being dragged out, doesn't it? So certainly in the schools and the teachers that I've been working with in the last few years around this, none of the teachers have really been sort of articulating Indigenous learning styles to us as an idea they're working with. So perhaps the sort of ideas with it in the South Australian context, but in your place, it's still there, isn't it? So I guess you can't really have a generic answer to it. I guess one needs to be sort of skillfully listening to how the sort of teachers are articulating it, and then doing one's best to sort of deconstruct any sort of essentialising that are going on, or to sort of at least push past some of the things that are that those sort of ideas sort of constrain.